My hands were shaking, but not from the weight of the silver tray. My manager, Mr. Henderson, had just hissed the word reckless in my ear again, his breath smelling of stale coffee and disappointment. He thought I was clumsy, a liability in the fine dining ballet of Bellini's. He didn't see the double shifts blurring my vision, or the worry for my brother Leo that gnawed at my bones, making my fingers feel like they belonged to someone else. I pushed through the swinging doors, the kitchen's chaotic symphony fading behind me, replaced by the hushed clinking of crystal and murmured conversations. The dining room was an ocean of dark wood and soft light, a world away from my cramped apartment and the mountain of medical bills burying me alive. My eyes scanned the room, a habit born of a waitress's need to anticipate, and they landed on him. In the furthest corner booth, sitting alone, was Marco Bellini, the owner. They called him the Ghost. He wasn't eating or drinking, he was just watching, his stillness a black hole in the center of the elegant room, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning as his gaze swept over everything, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, over me. Mr. Henderson's insults were just background noise to the number that played on a loop in my head, $53,712. That was the cost of the next experimental treatment for Leo, a figure so astronomical it felt like a joke. Reckless? I was the opposite of reckless. Every move I made was calculated, every extra shift a desperate scramble for a few more dollars to throw into that bottomless pit of debt. My friend Sophia caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, sympathetic smile. She knew. She was the only one who knew the exhaustion I hid behind a polite smile. I wonder if you know what it's like to feel that kind of pressure, where one dropped plate feels like the end of the world because it might mean losing the one job keeping your family alive. It's a silent, suffocating weight. If you've ever felt that kind of desperation, or if you're just finding yourself pulled into this world with me, I hope you'll stick around. You can do that by hitting the subscribe button and giving this video a like. It helps more than you know. And honestly, I could use a little support right now, because I had no idea that my entire life was about to shatter right alongside the crystal on my tray. The evening wore on, a blur of taking orders, refilling glasses, and forcing my feet to keep moving. I tried to avoid the corner booth, but it was impossible. Mr. Bellini's presence was magnetic, a quiet vortex of power that warped the very atmosphere around him. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken to anyone, yet he commanded the entire room. I was clearing a nearby table when I saw them. Two men, dressed like patrons, moving with a purpose that didn't fit the relaxed opulence of the restaurant. They were separating, one heading toward the back exit, while the other walked calmly, almost casually, toward Mr. Bellini's table. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Something was wrong. It was in the man's eyes, a flat, dead look that didn't belong here. He reached inside his jacket, and a flash of cold, dark metal caught the low light of a candle. A gun. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into a thick, syrupy dread. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but what my body was already doing. My feet were moving, my tray of empty wine glasses suddenly feeling as heavy as a shield, my path aimed directly between the silent hunter and his prey. There was no thought, only a raw animal instinct to stop what was about to happen. A scream tore from someone's throat, maybe mine. The heavy silver tray left my hands, flying through the air with a clumsy, desperate grace. It collided with the gunman's arm with a sickening thud, followed by the deafening crash of shattering glass and metal hitting the marble floor. I didn't stop. My momentum carried me forward, my shoulder slamming into the man's chest, sending us both stumbling sideways. The gun, knocked from his grasp, skittered across the polished floor, coming to a stop near the leg of another table. The entire restaurant froze in a collective gasp of shocked silence. The only sounds were my own ragged breaths and the soft, menacing click of the gunman's teeth as he glared at me with pure hatred. I was on the floor, my waitress apron stained with spilled wine that looked disturbingly like blood, my whole body trembling. And then I looked up, into the eyes of Marco Bellini. There was no gratitude there, no relief, just an unnerving, calculating stillness as he stared at me, his gaze intense and unreadable, as if I wasn't a person who had just saved his life, but a complex problem he now had to solve. Before I could even process what I'd done, two men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the restaurant, moving with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They were on the gunman in an instant, hauling him to his feet with a brutal twist of his arms that made him cry out in pain. They dragged him away through a back entrance as if he were nothing more than a sack of garbage. The patrons were whispering, some already fumbling for their phones, but a single, cold look from one of the remaining men silenced them all. Then Marco Bellini was standing over me. He didn't offer a hand. He simply looked down at the mess of glass, wine, and trembling waitress at his feet. "That was a foolish thing to do," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that held no warmth. He reached into his own jacket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a checkbook and a pen. "Name your price, for the trouble." The words were a slap in the face. He thought I wanted money? He thought my recklessness was for sale? "I don't want your money," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I pushed myself up, ignoring the sting of a small cut on my hand. His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossing his face before it was gone. "Everyone has a price," he stated, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the wreckage. I went home that night on autopilot, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. The memory of the gun, the shattered glass, and Marco Bellini's cold, assessing eyes played on a loop in my mind. All I wanted was to lock my door, check on Leo via our nightly text exchange, and pretend the world wasn't a place where men tried to kill each other in fancy restaurants. My apartment building's hallway was dimly lit as always, the flickering fluorescent light a familiar, depressing hum. But as I reached my door, apartment 3B, my blood ran cold. It was open, just a crack, but I always locked it. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed it open slowly. The sight that greeted me stole the breath from my lungs. My small, cluttered home had been completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, drawers were emptied, and the few sentimental things I owned were smashed on the floor. It wasn't a robbery, nothing was taken. It was a violation, a message. Lying in the middle of the floor, face down, was a framed photo of Leo and me, the glass shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. They knew about him. My one impulsive act of courage hadn't just put me in danger, it had painted a target on the only person in the world I had left to protect. Panic clawed at my throat, sharp and suffocating. This was my fault, all of it. I had invited this darkness into our lives. My phone felt like a lead weight in my hand as I thought about calling the police. But what would I say? That I'd interfered in a mob hit and now the monsters are at my door? They couldn't protect me from this. They couldn't protect Leo. I sank to my knees amidst the debris of my life, the shattered photo of my brother's smiling face clutched in my hand. Tears I didn't know I had been holding back finally fell, hot and useless. Just as a sob escaped my lips, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the open doorway. I froze, my body rigid with terror. I expected thugs, or worse, but the man standing there was older, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his expression grim and weary. It was Riccardo Valli, the man I'd seen whispering to Mr. Bellini at the restaurant. His eyes took in the scene of devastation, then landed on me. "Lena Petrova," he said, his voice devoid of pity. "Mr. Bellini anticipated this. He sent me to collect you. You and your brother are no longer safe here. You will come with me now." It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a command, a lifeline, and a cage presented in the very same breath. My old life was over, and my only path forward led straight back to the man I had just saved. The car ride was a silent, suffocating journey into a world I didn't belong in. Ricardo Valli drove with unnerving calm, the city lights smearing past the tinted windows like abstract paintings of a life that was no longer mine. I felt less like a person being rescued and more like a piece of evidence being transported. Every bump in the road was a jolt back to my trashed apartment, the violated sanctity of my home, the terrifying knowledge that someone knew about Leo. We pulled into a subterranean garage, the air thick with the smell of concrete and cold money, and ascended in a private elevator that moved with a silent, swift efficiency. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a monument to isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering cityscape like a conquered territory. The furniture was sparse, modern, and brutally expensive, all sharp angles and unforgiving surfaces in shades of black, white, and gray. There was no clutter, no warmth, no sign that a human being actually lived here. The consequences of my one reckless act crashed down on me the very next day. The first call was from Mr. Henderson, his voice oozing a false sympathy as he informed me my employment at Bellini's was terminated effective immediately. "It's for your own safety, you understand," he chirped, but the real message was clear. I was a problem, a loose thread in his perfectly woven tapestry, and he had snipped me without a second thought. Shortly after, an official eviction notice appeared on my splintered door, the stark black letters giving me 72 hours to vacate the premises. It was a complete and total system failure. My precarious life, held together with double shifts and desperate hope, had been demolished. I spent the day wandering the city in a daze, my pathetic resume clutched in my hand, but every potential employer saw the desperation in my eyes and turned me away. The number, that god-awful number for Leo's treatment, pulsed in my brain like a migraine. $53,712. I had tried to be a hero for a split second, and in return, the universe had decided to burn my entire world to the ground, leaving me with nothing but the ashes and the suffocating weight of my failure. The final, crushing blow arrived that evening in the form of a man named Victor. He was a collector for the loan shark I had visited in a moment of pure, unadulterated desperation months prior. A decision that now felt like signing my own death warrant. He cornered me as I was leaving the pharmacy with Leo's prescription, his hulking frame blocking the sidewalk, his smile a grotesque collection of yellowed teeth and predatory intent. He wasn't interested in my pleas for more time or my explanations about my job. He was interested in the vig, the exorbitant interest that grew like a cancer every single day. He grabbed my arm, his thick fingers digging into my flesh with bruising force, and leaned in close, his breath smelling of sour cigarettes. "A real shame it would be," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss, "if something unfortunate were to happen to a sick little boy in a hospital. Accidents happen all the time." The threat was so explicit, so vile, it stole the air from my lungs. This was no longer about money or eviction. This was a monster threatening to devour the only person I had left in the world. I wrenched my arm free and ran, the sound of his cruel laughter chasing me down the street. That night, I found my last bastion of support crumbling away. Sophia appeared at my door, her face a mask of horror as she took in the devastation of my apartment and the haunted look in my eyes. She brought a bag of groceries I knew I couldn't eat and wrapped me in a hug that felt like the only anchor in a raging sea. She offered me her couch, a gesture of such pure, uncomplicated kindness that it nearly broke me. But as we sat amongst the debris of my life, I saw the fear coiling behind her concerned expression. She had heard the whispers circulating at the restaurant, the dark rumors about the shooting, about the kind of men who frequented Mr. Bellini's corner booth. She was terrified for me, but I could see she was also terrified of what I had brought into my life, of the dangerous shadow that now clung to me. I couldn't drag her into this. I couldn't let my darkness touch her light. It was the most profoundly lonely realization I'd ever had. Protecting the people you love sometimes means cutting them out of your life completely. I forced a smile, lied about having a place to stay, and watched my best friend, my last connection to normalcy, walk away into the night. I must have drifted into an exhausted, dreamless sleep on the floor, because the next thing I registered was the pale gray light of dawn creeping through the grimy windows and the silhouette of a man standing in my open doorway. It was Marco Bellini. He wasn't wearing the immaculate suit I remembered, but was dressed in dark, simple clothes that somehow made him look even more dangerous, stripping away the veneer of the businessman to reveal the predator beneath. He didn't speak at first, his piercing gaze methodically cataloging the scene of destruction. He saw the overturned table, the shattered glass of the photo frame holding the picture of Leo and me, the stark white of the eviction notice taped to the wall. His eyes then settled on my arm, where the dark, ugly bruises from Victor's grip were already forming. I instinctively tried to hide them, a futile gesture born of shame and fear. A single muscle twitched in his jaw, the only outward sign of the cold, controlled fury radiating from him. He looked from the wreckage of my life to my face, and his expression held a terrifying stillness, the calm at the center of a hurricane. He had seen the truth of my situation, and he was not pleased. "This was Dante Rizzo," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was a statement of fact, not a question. "He thinks you are a vulnerability he can exploit. He will use your brother's illness, your financial desperation, anything he can to get to me through you." He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, picking up the crumpled medical bill from my counter. He held it for a moment, his face an unreadable mask of stone, as he read the figure aloud. $53,712. The number sounded grotesque and trivial all at once coming from his lips. He finally met my gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made me feel stripped bare, as if he could see every fear I had ever harbored. My enemies, and I, have always believed that emotional attachments are a fatal weakness. When you acted in the restaurant, you inadvertently created an attachment. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. "That makes you my responsibility now. Your problems are now my problems." The declaration was a double-edged sword, offering a shield while simultaneously forging a chain. He laid out his terms with the detached precision of a general planning a campaign. There was no room for negotiation. It was an ultimatum wrapped in the guise of an offer. First, I would leave this apartment immediately and move into a secure residence owned by him, a place his enemies could not penetrate. Second, my brother's medical debt would be settled in its entirety, and all his future treatments would be funded through a private foundation, ensuring he received the best care possible. Third, the loan shark, Victor, would cease to be a factor in my life, permanently. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. In exchange for all this, my life would effectively be his. I would work for him directly, not as a waitress, but in a capacity that required my constant proximity, keeping me under his watchful eye at all times. "You will not go anywhere without my knowledge," he stated, his voice flat and absolute. "You will sever ties with your old life. You will be completely dependent on me for your safety." He was offering me a lifeline, but it was attached to a gilded cage, and the price of my brother's life was my own freedom. "Why?" The word escaped my lips as a ragged whisper, the only protest my exhausted mind could muster. "I'm a stranger, a clumsy waitress who got in the way. Why would you do any of this?" I expected a cold, calculated answer about honor or owing a debt. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. his gaze unwavering as he seemed to weigh his response. "Because the world I inhabit has rules, Lena," he finally said, his voice imbued with a profound weariness. "Rizzo broke those rules. He targeted a civilian to send me a message. Men like Victor broke those rules. They prey on the desperate and threaten the helpless." His eyes flickered down to the bruises on my arm, and the chillingly calm fury returned, colder and sharper than before. "I do not tolerate men who harm women. I do not permit threats against children. Your foolish courage put you in my world, and in my world, we eliminate the predators. We do not let them win." He wasn't offering me charity. He was offering me his own brutal, unyielding form of justice. He was no white knight, but he was the only one with a sword big enough to slay the dragons that were burning my life to the ground. My gaze drifted around the ruined apartment, the pathetic symbol of my failed struggle for independence. I saw the shattered frame that once held my brother's smiling face, and I felt the phantom grip of Victor's fingers on my arm, heard his poisonous threat against Leo. I had no other options. Every door was closed, every path blocked. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford when my brother's life was on the line. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like I was inhaling glass, I met Marco Bellini's intense, waiting eyes. "Okay," I said, the single word tasting of both surrender and defiance. An almost imperceptible shift occurred in his expression, not of victory or satisfaction, but of a heavy, somber finality. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Ricardo will be here in 1 hour. Pack only what is sentimental and necessary. You will not be coming back." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a silence that was more deafening than all the chaos that came before. In that moment, I ceased to be just Lena Petrova. I had become the ghost's responsibility, a protected asset in a deadly game, and I was terrified I would never find my way back to myself. The penthouse was less a home and more a mausoleum for a life that had never been lived. It was a sterile expanse of polished concrete, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the city like a silent, glittering jewel Marco Bellini owned. Riccardo Valli had laid out the rules with the detached air of a prison warden. I was not to leave without an escort. My phone calls were to be monitored. My schedule was no longer my own. I was a protected asset, a ghost in a glass tower, and the loneliness was more profound than any I had ever known in my cramped, cluttered apartment. My first evening, Marco found me standing before the vast window, staring down at the river of headlights. He didn't say hello. He simply stood beside me, a silent, imposing presence. "Ricardo informed me your brother's transfer to the Chilton wing is complete," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The doctors there are the best in the country." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was a statement of a transaction completed. I felt a surge of bitter resentment mixed with a humiliating wave of gratitude. I was safe, Leo was safe, but I was also a bird in a beautiful, unbreakable cage, and the man beside me was my keeper. I spent the first few days in a state of suspended animation, wandering the vast, empty rooms like a phantom. The silence was the worst part, broken only by the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the distant, muted sounds of the city below. One night, sleep was an impossibility, my mind a relentless carousel of shattered glass and Victor's leering face. I found myself in the cavernous kitchen, its stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the cold, recessed lighting. I was tracing the patterns in the marble countertop when Marco appeared in the doorway, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the hallway. He was holding a glass of water, but he stopped when he saw me. "You should be resting," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. The command in his tone made something snap inside me. "Resting?" I shot back, my voice trembling with a week's worth of suppressed fear and rage. "Is that what you do when you feel like your whole world is a cage you can't escape? Do you even know what it feels like to be helpless, Mr. Bellini?" He didn't answer, his dark eyes just watching me, unblinking. After a long, tense moment, he walked past me, opened a cabinet, and took out a mug, filling it with milk and setting it in the microwave without a word. The quiet, domestic act was so jarringly out of character that it silenced me completely. The next morning, I saw a different side of the man, one that was far more terrifying than his silence. I was in the living area, trying to read a book I couldn't focus on, when Ricardo arrived with two other men, their faces grim and set like stone. They spoke in low, urgent Italian, but I understood the tone perfectly. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered. From the fragments I could piece together, I gathered they had found the man who had ransacked my apartment, one of Dante Rizzo's lower-level thugs. Marco listened intently, his expression unreadable, before issuing a series of quiet, clipped commands. I didn't understand the words, but the chilling finality in his voice was universal. He said something about loose ends and a message that will not be misunderstood. As the men left, their movements efficient and deadly, a cold dread settled deep in my bones. I was witnessing the inner workings of his world, a place where justice was not blind but brutally precise. His violence wasn't the chaotic rage of a street thug, it was the calculated, surgical strike of a predator, and I was living in the very center of his hunting ground. He was protecting me, yes, but he was doing it with a darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. That feeling of being watched, of being an anomaly in a dangerous ecosystem, was amplified a day later. Ricardo was giving Marco a daily briefing at the massive dining table that served as a makeshift boardroom. I was sitting on a sofa across the room, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. They were discussing supply routes and security protocols when Ricardo's tone shifted. "There's a leak," he said, his voice tight. The details of the boys' new security detail at Chilton, the specific room assignment, Rizzo's people knew within an hour. That information was on a closed loop. His gaze, sharp and suspicious, flickered over to me for a fraction of a second. It was enough. He saw me as the weak link, the outsider who had brought chaos into their controlled world. Before I could even flinch, Marco's voice cut through the air, cold as ice. No. It was a single word, spoken without him even looking at Ricardo, but it carried the weight of an iron door slamming shut. He was defending me, silently and absolutely, but the incident left a bitter taste in my mouth. The threat wasn't just outside these bulletproof windows, it was inside, in the suspicious glances and the constant, unnerving assessment of my worth and my loyalty. The psychological warfare began 2 days later. A courier delivered a sleek black box addressed to me. One of Marco's men scanned it and checked it for threats before handing it over, his face impassive. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a single, perfect white rose, its petals already starting to brown at the edges. Tucked beneath it was a small, stiff card. It contained only one word, printed in a stark, blocky font: reckless. The air rushed from my lungs. It was a message from Dante Rizzo, a poisoned arrow aimed directly at my deepest insecurity. He was mocking me, reminding me that my one impulsive act was the cause of all this. I sank onto the sofa, the box in my lap, feeling the walls of my gilded cage closing in. Marco found me there moments later. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply took the box from my hands, his eyes hardening into chips of obsidian as he saw its content. He disposed of it without a word, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed rhythmically. That evening, when I went to my room, a crystal vase stood on my nightstand. In it was a single, deep red rose, so vibrant and alive it seemed to radiate warmth into the cold, sterile room. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Marco insisted I see Leo. He said it was important for my brother's morale, and for mine. The trip to the hospital was a meticulously planned military operation. I was flanked by 2 guards, hulking men who never spoke, and driven in an armored SUV with windows so dark the world outside seemed like a distant film. The Chilton wing was beautiful, more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, and Leo's private room had a view of a serene garden. He looked better than he had in months, the color returning to his cheeks. He was thrilled, attributing his good fortune to a new charity program I had fabricated. The lies felt like swallowing shards of glass. I couldn't hug him without a guard shifting his weight in the doorway. I couldn't answer his questions about my new job with anything but vague, hollow pleasantries. He was sharp, though, and I saw the confusion in his eyes. "You seem different, Lena," he said quietly. "Sad." The visit, meant to be a comfort, was a new kind of torture. It highlighted the chasm that now existed between my old life and this terrifying new reality. I was providing for his safety, but I was losing my brother behind a wall of necessary secrets. A week later, Marco informed me we were going out. It wasn't a request. "Rizzo needs to see that you are not a prisoner," he explained, his tone clinical. "He needs to see that you are with me by choice. It is a projection of strength." The destination was an opulent, dimly lit restaurant, a place that reeked of old money and unspoken power. It was neutral territory, a place where business was conducted between families. From the moment we walked in, I felt hundreds of eyes on me. They weren't just curious, they were calculating, assessing my value, my position, my weakness. I was Marco Bellini's new acquisition, and they were all wondering how to leverage it. A young, arrogant man with cruel eyes and an expensive suit approached our table, a captain from the Toscani family. He ignored Marco and smiled at me. "Bellini always did have an eye for strays," he said, his voice dripping with condescending charm. Before I could react, Marco's hand settled on the small of my back, a gesture that was both possessive and grounding. He leaned forward slightly and said something to the man in a voice too low for me to hear. The captain's face went white, and he backed away from our table as if he'd been burned, the smirk wiped clean from his face. In that moment, I wasn't Lena. I was a symbol of Marco's power, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever been. The drive back to the penthouse was silent and tense. The display of power at the restaurant had left me shaken, my nerves raw. We were only a few blocks from the building when it happened. A dark sedan, moving with impossible speed, slammed into our side, the screech of tortured metal and shattering glass a deafening explosion of sound. I was thrown against the door, my head striking the window. It wasn't a random collision. It was a deliberate, violent message. Our driver, a man named Enzo, reacted instantly, his face a mask of professional calm, as he accelerated, forcing the other car to swerve and fall back before speeding away into the night. My ears were ringing, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was physically unharmed, but my entire body trembled with the shock of the impact. When we arrived in the subterranean garage, Marco was already there, waiting by the elevator, his face carved from granite. He pulled my door open before Enzo could, and his hands were on me, his eyes scanning me for injuries with a raw, frantic intensity that shattered his usual composure. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. His grip on my arms was firm, his touch a strange, terrifying mix of fury and fear. The danger was no longer a shadow. It was here, tangible and deadly. Later that night, the illusion of safety was irrevocably shattered. I was trying to calm my racing heart with a cup of tea when Ricardo entered the living area, his face pale, holding a tablet. He didn't speak, simply handed it to Marco. The screen displayed a grainy security feed from the hallway outside Leo's hospital room. A man dressed as an orderly lingered near the door for a moment, looking over his shoulder before taping something to the wood and walking away. The camera zoomed in. It was a photograph of me, taken during one of my shifts at Bellini's, my hair tied back, a tired smile on my face. A thick, brutal red line had been drawn across my throat. The message was hideously clear. "We can get to him, we can get to you. Your fortress is nothing." A wave of nausea washed over me, so intense I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. All the guards, the armored cars, the bulletproof glass, it was all a fragile facade. They could reach into my life and touch the one person I had done all of this to protect. I looked at Marco, expecting to see his usual cold fury, but what I saw instead stopped my breath. For the first time since I'd met him, beneath the rage, I saw a flicker of raw, undeniable fear, not for himself, but for me, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The photograph was a declaration of war. Marco's response was swift and absolute. Within an hour, he had decided the penthouse was no longer secure. It was a glittering target in the sky. We were to move to a fortified estate he owned north of the city, a place he called the Sanctuary. We left under the cover of darkness in a 3-car convoy, a silent, grim procession through the sleeping city. I sat beside him in the back of the lead vehicle, the tension a living thing in the small space between us. The city lights fell away, replaced by the dark, lonely stretch of a 2-lane country road shrouded in mist. That was when the world exploded. The first car behind us erupted in a ball of fire, the force of the blast lifting our own vehicle and slamming it back down onto the asphalt. Our driver, Enzo, wrestled with the wheel as a hail of automatic gunfire strafed our sides, the sound a deafening metallic rain. Marco's body was on mine in an instant, shielding me, his weight a heavy, solid wall against the chaos. He was shouting orders in Italian, his voice a raw, furious command over the sound of screaming tires and shattering glass. Through the cracked window, I saw them, dark figures emerging from the trees, their guns aimed directly at us. Enzo performed a maneuver that seemed to defy physics, spinning the car 180 degrees and accelerating back toward the inferno, using the burning wreckage of the other vehicle as a shield. Another of Marco's men laid down covering fire from the passenger window, the sharp reports of his handgun a counter-rhythm to the enemy's assault. My face was pressed into the fine wool of Marco's coat, my senses overwhelmed by the smell of gunpowder, burning fuel, and his own scent, something clean and sharp beneath the chaos. We broke through their line, careening down a narrow, unpaved side road I hadn't even seen. Branches scraped against the car like skeletal fingers as we plunged deeper into the woods. When we finally skidded to a stop in a hidden clearing, the only sounds were the ticking of the hot engine and our own ragged breaths. Marco didn't move from his position over me for a long moment. I could feel the violent tremor running through his body, not of fear, but of pure, unrestrained rage. He had built an empire on the foundation of control, and tonight, Dante Rizzo had proven that control was an illusion. When he finally lifted himself off me, his eyes met mine in the dim light of the dashboard, and I saw a darkness there that was more terrifying than the ambush itself. The safe house was a relic from another time, a small stone hunting cabin hidden deep within the state forest, miles from any road. It was cold, damp, and smelled of wood smoke and neglect. Enzo and the other guard, Nico, secured the perimeter while Marco forced the heavy wooden door open. Inside, dust motes danced in the single beam of my phone's flashlight. There was a stone fireplace, 2 threadbare armchairs, and little else. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Marco was moving stiffly, and in the flickering light, I saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. "You're hurt," I whispered, my voice sounding small in the oppressive silence. He glanced down, as if just noticing it. "It's a graze, nothing." He tried to dismiss it, turning away to inspect the room, but he winced as he moved. "Let me see it," I insisted, my voice firmer now. I wasn't his fragile asset anymore. I was the girl who had spent years tending to a sick brother, who knew the difference between a scratch and something that needed care. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his control warring with the pain he refused to acknowledge. Finally, with a heavy, reluctant sigh, he nodded once and sank into one of the dusty armchairs. I found a rusty first aid kit under the sink with antiseptic and some old gauze. My hands were surprisingly steady as I carefully cut away the ruined fabric of his expensive shirt. The bullet had torn a shallow furrow across the muscle of his shoulder, painful but not critical. As I cleaned the wound, the silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken things. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the empty fireplace, his jaw tight. "Why does he hate you so much?" I asked quietly, dabbing the antiseptic onto his skin. He didn't answer right away, and I thought he would ignore me. Then his voice came, low and rough with memory. "It's not about hate. It's about a message. Years ago, my family and the Rizzos were allies. A deal went wrong. Dante's father saw it as a betrayal. He retaliated." He paused, and the air grew colder. "They didn't come for me. They went after my sister, Isabella. She was 17. She wasn't in the life, knew nothing about it. They ran her car off the road, made it look like an accident." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were hollowed-out caverns of grief. "I was supposed to pick her up that day. I was late." That is the price of attachment, Lena. That is the weakness they always find. His confession hung in the air, a ghost of a 17-year-old girl filling the space between us. I saw it then, the architecture of his solitude, the reason for his impenetrable walls. He wasn't cold, he was haunted. My own guilt, a constant, simmering companion, boiled over. "This is my fault," I choked out, the words tasting like ash. "The picture at the hospital, this ambush. He's doing to you what was done to you before. He's using me, using Leo, to create the same pain." Tears I hadn't let myself shed finally fell, hot and shameful, dripping onto the back of my hands as I fumbled with the gauze. Everyone has always called me reckless. My manager, my teachers, even Sophia sometimes. I never mean to be. I'm just trying so hard to hold everything together that things break. I broke your life, Marco. I saw a gun and I didn't think, and now your men are hurt, maybe worse. And you took a bullet that was meant for me. I couldn't look at him, staring instead at the wound I was dressing, a wound that felt like a symbol of all the damage I had caused. I was a catastrophe, a walking disaster who had stumbled into a world of monsters and given him a brand new weapon to use. He reached out then, his uninjured hand covering mine, stilling my trembling fingers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence we had just endured. "Stop," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through my spiraling self-loathing. I finally forced myself to meet his gaze. The hollowness was gone, replaced by an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "What you did in the restaurant was not reckless," he stated, each word delivered with absolute certainty. "For years, I have surrounded myself with men who are paid for their loyalty, who follow orders. You acted from instinct, from something good, something I had forgotten existed." He moved his hand from mine, his thumb coming up to brush away a tear from my cheek. His touch was electric, a spark in the cold, dusty cabin. "You are not a liability, Lena. You are not a weakness. You are the only thing in my world that is real, and I will burn it all to the ground before I let anyone harm you." The space between us shrank until there was no space at all, only the heat of his words and the profound, terrifying truth in his eyes. The spell was broken by the crackle of a satellite phone from his jacket pocket. The moment of raw intimacy shattered, and the cold reality of our situation rushed back in. He answered it, his posture shifting back into that of a commander, his voice once again clipped and hard. It was Ricardo. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Marco's face change, his expression hardening from stone into something far more dangerous. The muscle in his jaw pulsed rhythmically. He listened for a long time, his only response a series of guttural one-word acknowledgments in Italian. When he finally ended the call, the silence he left behind was heavier, more menacing than before. "The ambush was a diversion," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all the warmth it had held just moments before. "While we were pinned down here, Rizzo's men made a move on one of my warehouses on the docks. They didn't take anything, they just walked in. The security codes were disabled from the inside." His eyes, dark and chilling, found mine. Ricardo was right. There is a traitor, someone high up, someone who knew our exact route tonight, someone who knew where to find this place. We were no longer just running from an external enemy. We were trapped in a cage with a viper we couldn't see. The feeling of his thumb on my cheek still lingered, a phantom warmth against my cold skin, but the man in front of me was gone, replaced once more by the ghost. Yet something had fundamentally changed. As he stood up and began pacing the small cabin, issuing a new set of quiet, lethal-sounding instructions into the phone, his gaze kept finding mine across the room. It wasn't the assessing, calculating look of a protector guarding an asset. It was the look of a man who had just found something precious, only to realize he was holding it in the middle of a minefield. Dante Rizzo had wanted to find Marco's weakness, to isolate him and break him with the memory of a past tragedy. He had succeeded in isolating us, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He hadn't just given Marco a weakness to exploit. Standing there in that dusty, forgotten cabin, I understood with chilling certainty that he had given Marco a reason to become a monster far more ruthless than Rizzo could ever imagine. And I was standing in the very center of the coming storm. The sanctuary was a fortress of silence, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the dead, heavy quiet of a tomb. We had made it, but the victory felt like a prelude to a funeral. Marco was no longer the man who had touched my face with such gentle reverence in the cabin. He was the ghost again, a being of cold fury and calculated movements. He spoke into his satellite phone in clipped, brutal Italian, his voice a weapon in the oppressive stillness of the grand wood-paneled study. The brief, fragile bridge that had formed between us in the dusty hunting lodge had been incinerated in the fires of the ambush. I was once again the asset, the problem, the epicenter of the chaos that had ripped through his world. He had confirmed the traitor was someone deep inside his organization, someone who knew his protocols, his safe houses, his very thoughts. This wasn't a war with an external enemy anymore. The poison was already in the bloodstream, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my gut, that I was the reason the disease had been allowed to fester and spread, weakening the entire structure from within. The first reports from the city arrived like shrapnel from a distant explosion. Enzo, the driver who had saved our lives with his impossible skill, was in critical condition, his future uncertain. Nico, the other guard who had laid down covering fire, the man who kept a worn photo of his 2 smiling daughters tucked into his sun visor, had not survived. His name echoed in the vast, empty halls of the estate, a testament to the price of my one reckless act. I felt his loss as a physical weight, a crushing pressure on my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I had caused this. My clumsy, impulsive heroism had signed his death warrant. I found Marco staring out a window at the rain-lashed grounds, his reflection a pale, grim mask in the glass. I tried to say I was sorry, but the words felt pathetic and useless, a child's apology for an adult catastrophe. He didn't turn. "Sorrow is a useless currency here, Lena," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It doesn't bring back my men." His coldness was a wall, and on the other side of it, I was completely, utterly alone with the ghosts I had created. Ricardo Valley arrived the next morning, a storm cloud of grief and fury condensed into human form. His eyes, usually so sharp and pragmatic, were red-rimmed and filled with a deep, simmering rage that seemed directed entirely at me. He and Marco disappeared into the study, and I could hear the muffled, angry cadence of their Italian, the words "La Cameriera" spat out like a curse. Later, when Marco was gone, Ricardo cornered me in the library. He didn't raise his voice. The quiet venom of his words was far more terrifying. "Every man he has lost, every drop of blood spilled since that night in the restaurant is on you," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You are the weakness, the infection." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with decades of pain. "He has made this mistake before. The betrayal that killed his sister, Isabella, she wasn't alone in that car. His fiancée, Elena, was with her. And the man who sold them out was his own cousin, family. He trusted him, just as he is trusting you. You are not a person to him. You are a ghost he is trying to save, and you will be the death of us all." The name, Elena, was a final, devastating blow, turning my guilt into a certainty. I was not his future. I was just a tragic echo of his past. The hunt for the traitor consumed Marco, twisting his grief into a cold, indiscriminate paranoia. He became a stranger, a man carved from ice and suspicion, and the warmth I'd felt in the cabin seemed like a fever dream. The breaking point came 2 days later. Acting on intelligence that I now know was deliberately flawed, he decided the mole was one of his oldest and most loyal captains, a gruff, honorable man named Sal. I was there when Marco summoned him. He didn't present evidence. He delivered a verdict. Sal, a man who had known Marco since he was a boy, a man who had been Nico's closest friend, stood there, his face ashen with disbelief, as Marco accused him of betrayal. He begged, he swore on his children's lives, but Marco was deaf to his pleas. "You are dead to this family," Marco said, his voice colder than a grave. "Leave, now." He banished him, casting him out into a world where Rizzo's men would surely find him. I was horrified, watching the monster completely devour the man. I ran to Marco after Sal was gone, grabbing his arm. "That wasn't justice," I cried. "You're wrong, I can feel it." He ripped his arm from my grasp, his eyes blazing with a fury that finally, for the first time, was aimed directly at me. "You feel nothing," he snarled. "You are a waitress. You know nothing of my world. Stay out of my business." That was our arrangement. His words severed the last, fraying thread of our connection. He was right. I was a waitress, an outsider, a foolish girl who had stumbled into a world she didn't understand and had broken everything she touched. Ricardo's words played on a loop in my head. "You are the infection." I was making Marco into this paranoid, unjust creature. My presence was the fulcrum Rizzo was using to pry his entire world apart. Protecting Marco no longer meant standing by his side. It meant vanishing from his life entirely. If I was gone, Rizzo's leverage would be gone. The internal pressure on Marco would ease. He could think clearly again, be the leader his family needed him to be. It was a desperate, heartbreaking calculation, but it was the only one that made sense. I had to leave. I had to break our deal and run, not for my own safety, but for his. The estate was a prison, every door watched, every window alarmed. But I had one link to my old life, one person who might help me disappear. I had to find a way to contact Sophia, to get a message to the outside world, even if it meant stepping out from under the only protection that was keeping my brother alive. The house was a labyrinth of shadows and silence, each tick of a grandfather clock amplifying my frantic heartbeat. I found an unused service phone in a small pantry off the kitchen, my hands trembling as I shielded the faint light of the screen. I was about to dial when I heard a voice from the adjacent study, a low murmur that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was Riccardo Valli, his tone hushed and conspiratorial. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the cold wood of the door. He was speaking Italian, but the name he spoke was a universal language of betrayal. Rizzo. My blood turned to ice. He was the traitor. It had been him all along. He was the one feeding information, orchestrating the chaos, pointing Marco's suspicion in every direction but his own. I heard him detail the route and time for Leo's upcoming transfer to a new, more secure facility, a transfer Marco had arranged just that morning. He was giving my brother to them. All his warnings, his feigned grief for Nico, his venomous accusations toward me, it had all been a masterful, demonic performance designed to isolate Marco and position himself to take control. I was a pawn in a much older, deadlier game, and the man Marco trusted most in the world was about to burn it all to the ground. I backed away from the door, my mind screaming. I was trapped. Running was no longer an option. It would be playing directly into his hands, leaving Marco utterly blind and Leo completely defenseless. I had to warn him, but how? Ricardo was his shadow, his most trusted advisor. My word against his would be nothing but the ravings of a hysterical girl he had already pushed away. I stumbled back into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, and turned a corner, colliding with a solid chest. I looked up into the cold, dead eyes of Ricardo Valli. He knew. He knew I had heard. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "Such a reckless girl," he whispered, the words dripping with mock pity. "He never should have gotten involved." From the shadows behind him, 2 men emerged. I recognized them not as Marco's guards, but as the faces from the restaurant, the men who had come for Marco that first night. One of them lunged forward, and a rough, chemical-smelling cloth was pressed hard over my mouth and nose. The world dissolved into a vortex of blackness. My last conscious thought, a silent scream of Marco's name. The trap had been sprung, and I had walked right into it, leaving the man I loved alone, betrayed, and completely unaware that the real monster was standing right beside him. When I woke, it was to the smell of rust and damp concrete, a metallic taste coating my tongue. I was in a chair, my wrists bound with zip ties that cut into my skin. Ricardo Valli stood before me, his expression one of smug triumph, while Dante Rizzo lounged against a wall, observing me like a piece of meat. The fear was a cold, living thing in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a white-hot rage. I looked directly at Ricardo, ignoring the man who had started all of this. "He'll find you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It won't be because of me. It will be because you made a mistake. You underestimated him. You thought his grief made him stupid, but it just made him careful. You were his family, his most trusted friend, and you sold him out for what? This pathetic man's approval?" I nodded toward Rizzo. "He'll never trust you. Marco will hunt you to the ends of the earth, not for revenge, but for the insult. You thought he was the monster, but you have no idea what he'll become to get me back." Ricardo's smile faltered, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I wasn't just a victim. I was Marco's voice, and I was going to be the last thing he ever heard. I would later learn that Marco's discovery of my absence was not met with panic, but with a terrifying, absolute stillness. He found my room empty, the silence a deafening scream. He didn't waste a second. He went straight to the estate's central security hub, locking the doors behind him. He didn't look for signs of a struggle. He looked for the absence of evidence. For hours, he replayed the feeds, his eyes scanning for the one detail that was out of place. He found it in a 2-second data lag on the camera covering the south perimeter, a digital hiccup that occurred at the exact moment Ricardo's car had exited the grounds for an unscheduled supply run. It was a flaw so minor, so perfectly masked, only someone with Marco's obsessive need for control would have ever noticed it. And then he saw it, a small, dark object on the passenger seat of Ricardo's car as it left. It was the red rose from the crystal vase in my room, the one he had given me. Ricardo hadn't just taken me, he had taken Marco's one gesture of hope and was using it as a trophy. The coldness in Marco's heart ignited into a focused, glacial inferno. The hunt was on. My words had struck a nerve. Rizzo pushed himself off the wall, a cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. "She has spirit," he said to Rizzo, as if I weren't there. "Just like Elena. You remember Elena, don't you, Valli? the fire she had right before the end. Ricardo flinched, the first genuine emotion I had seen on his face. This was his weakness. He hadn't just betrayed Marco, he had been part of the original sin, the one that had hollowed Marco out years ago. I pressed the advantage. "He trusted you," I whispered, my voice laced with venom. "He mourned with you, and you let him blame himself all these years while you held the knife that killed his sister." Rizzo's plan became hideously clear. He wasn't just going to kill Marco, he was going to have Ricardo do it, a final, poetic act of betrayal to utterly destroy him. And then he would move on Leo. I had to do something, anything. I began straining against the zip ties, the plastic biting deep into my flesh, my mind racing to find a weapon, a weakness, a single crack in their plan that I could shatter into 1,000 pieces. My recklessness had started this, and my recklessness was going to have to be what ended it. The proof Marco needed came not from a camera, but from a bank. He cross-referenced Ricardo's unscheduled departure with a series of encrypted financial transactions. For years, small, untraceable payments had been flowing from a dormant Bellini account, an account only Ricardo had the codes for, into a shell corporation owned by the Rizzo family. The payments had stopped the day after Isabella and Elena were killed, and they had started again the night I saved Marco's life in the restaurant. It was a ledger of betrayal written in blood and money. Ricardo hadn't just been a traitor, he had been a sleeper agent for 20 years, his loyalty a long, patient lie. The realization hit Marco not with rage, but with a profound, soul-crushing clarity. He had banished Sal, an innocent man. He had pushed me away, the one person who saw him clearly, because he was blinded by the ghost of a past betrayal he never truly understood. He had been a king playing checkers, while his most trusted bishop was setting up a checkmate. Now, with the truth laid bare, he wasn't just coming to save me. He was coming to reclaim his own soul from the man who had stolen it long ago. My words had struck a nerve. Rizzo pushed himself off the wall, a cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. "She has spirit," he said to Rizzo, as if I weren't there. "Just like Elena. You remember Elena, don't you, Volley? The fire she had right before the end." Ricardo flinched, the first genuine emotion I had seen on his face. This was his weakness. He hadn't just betrayed Marco, he had been part of the original sin, the one that had hollowed Marco out years ago. I pressed the advantage. "He trusted you," I whispered, my voice laced with venom. "He mourned with you, and you let him blame himself all these years while you held the knife that killed his sister." Rizzo's plan became hideously clear. He wasn't just going to kill Marco, he was going to have Ricardo do it, a final, poetic act of betrayal to utterly destroy him. And then he would move on Leo. I had to do something, anything. I began straining against the zip ties, the plastic biting deep into my flesh, my mind racing to find a weapon, a weakness, a single crack in their plan that I could shatter into 1,000 pieces. My recklessness had started this, and my recklessness was going to have to be what ended it. The proof Marco needed came not from a camera, but from a bank. He cross-referenced Ricardo's unscheduled departure with a series of encrypted financial transactions. For years, small, untraceable payments had been flowing from a dormant Bellini account, an account only Ricardo had the codes for, into a shell corporation owned by the Rizzo family. The payments had stopped the day after Isabella and Elena were killed, and they had started again the night I saved Marco's life in the restaurant. It was a ledger of betrayal written in blood and money. Ricardo hadn't just been a traitor, He had been a sleeper agent for 20 years, his loyalty a long, patient lie. The realization hit Marco not with rage, but with a profound, soul-crushing clarity. He had banished Sal, an innocent man. He had pushed me away, the one person who saw him clearly, because he was blinded by the ghost of a past betrayal he never truly understood. He had been a king playing checkers, while his most trusted bishop was setting up a checkmate. The warehouse door slid open with a deafening groan, and Marco stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't flanked by an army. He was alone, a solitary figure of immense, controlled power. Rizzo laughed, pressing the cold barrel of a pistol to my temple. "The ghost appears," he taunted. "Come to save another stray? You never learn, do you, Bellini? Attachments are a cancer." Marco's eyes were locked on mine, and in them I saw no fear, only a promise. He ignored Rizzo and spoke directly to Ricardo. "It ends tonight, old friend, all of it." He then looked at Rizzo. "Let her go," Marco said, his voice a low, chilling command. "Let her walk out that door, and you can have me. My territory, my accounts, my life. It's all yours. A trade." The offer hung in the air, stunning both men into silence. He was willing to burn his entire empire to the ground for me. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the final, absolute refutation of his life's code. For a moment, I saw greed flicker in Ricardo's eyes, but Rizzo just smiled, a predator who had finally cornered his lifelong obsession. "A touching offer," he sneered, "but I think I'll have both." That was his mistake. He thought Marco's offer was a sign of weakness, but it was a signal for me. As Rizzo's attention was fixed on Marco, I did the one thing they never expected. With a surge of adrenaline, I snapped my head back, slamming the crown of my skull into Rizzo's nose with a sickening crunch. He roared in pain, stumbling back, his grip on the gun loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Marco needed. He moved with a speed that was inhuman, a blur of motion and violence. 2 shots echoed in the vast space, precise and final. Ricardo fell, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Rizzo, clutching his shattered face, tried to raise his weapon, but Marco was already on him. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. When it was over, there was only silence, broken by the sound of my own ragged breaths. Marco came to me, his hands gentle as he cut the ties from my wrists. He pulled me to my feet and into his arms, holding me tightly against his chest. His heart hammered against mine. "You were right," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard before. I never knew what a monster I could be until I had something real to protect. In that moment, we weren't a boss and his liability. We were survivors. We were family, and we were finally free. The weeks that followed were a strange, surreal calm after a hurricane. The warehouse where I'd been held was scrubbed clean of its violent history by men who moved with silent, grim efficiency, erasing the final traces of Ricardo Valli and Dante Rizzo from the world. Marco was a constant, solid presence at my side, his hand often finding mine, a simple, grounding touch that said more than words ever could. He wasn't just a leader reasserting control. He was a man methodically mending the foundations of his life. One of his first calls was to Sal, the captain he had wrongly banished. I listened as Marco, his voice heavy with a humility I never thought I'd hear, apologized and asked him to come home. Sal's return was a quiet, solemn affair, a testament to a loyalty that had been tested by fire and proven true. I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was part of the intricate machinery of this new world, not as a liability, but as the reason the machine had been purged of its deepest poison. In the quiet moments, I would look at Marco and see not the ghost, but the man who had walked into the fire for me. and I knew that the wreckage of our past was becoming the foundation of our future. 6 months later, the world was almost unrecognizable. Leo's surgery was a resounding success, and the sound of his easy, healthy laughter filled our new home. A beautiful stone house with a sprawling garden that felt a world away from the cold glass tower of the penthouse. The number that once haunted my every waking moment, $53,712, was now just a distant, powerless echo. I had found my own footing in Marco's world, not with a weapon, but with a ledger and a vision. He had given me full control of his legitimate businesses, starting with Bellini's. I transformed it from a place of hushed, intimidating power into a warm, vibrant restaurant that was always full. I spent my days tasting sauces, training staff, and building something that brought joy instead of fear. Marco would often come by in the late afternoon, not as the owner, but as a man watching the woman he loved thrive. He'd stand in the doorway of the kitchen, a small, genuine smile on his face, and in his eyes I saw a pride that healed the part of me that had always felt invisible and clumsy. I was no longer just the woman he protected. I was his partner, building a life alongside him, piece by piece. One cool autumn evening, I found Marco in the garden, standing by a newly planted rose bush, its single red bloom a vibrant splash of color against the twilight. He turned as I approached, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. He took my hands in his touch gentle and sure. "Ricardo was wrong about so many things," he said quietly, his gaze intense. "But he was right, one. I was trying to save a ghost. Not you, Lena, myself." I was haunted by the woman I failed to protect, and I almost let that ghost destroy the one person who could truly save me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant platinum band, not a diamond in sight. "This isn't a cage," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he slid it onto my finger. "It's an anchor. It's a promise that you are my home, my sanctuary, my family." Leo came out onto the porch then, calling our names, his voice strong and clear. We turned to watch him, and Marco wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. In the safety of his embrace, I finally understood. He wasn't my savior, and I wasn't his. We had saved each other. They used to call me reckless, a clumsy waitress, a liability, a girl who moved too fast and thought too little, always on the verge of dropping the tray and shattering everything. But that one single, impulsive act, the thing they all saw as my greatest flaw, was the beginning of my entire life. It led me into a world of darkness, but it also led me to him. Marco never saw me as reckless. From the very first moment I stood up from that floor of shattered glass, he saw me as brave. He saw the fighter I never knew I was, and in his world, that was the only thing that mattered. Standing here now, with his ring on my finger and my brother's happy chatter filling the peaceful evening air, I know that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, something you fight for, something you are willing to burn the world down to protect. This is the life that was forged in fire, a quiet, beautiful peace earned through chaos. I'm so grateful you've been here to witness it, to see how it all turned out. Your support means more people get to find stories like this one, stories that remind us that even in the darkest of nights, a single act of courage can be enough to bring the dawn.